It's too late now to ask to... Whoa!
Persona.
Welcome to the Velvet Room. Thou hast opened thine eyes. Time is now!
The Megami Tensei series is a series very near and dear to my heart, and my absolute favorite franchise ever. And it's a long series of games, spin-offs, and novels that's honestly some of the best media I've ever experienced. From SMT to Persona to Soul Hackers and so on, I've played a good amount, but I haven't tried everything. But I first started this franchise with a little known game known as Persona 4 Golden. I first played this game about 2 years ago now on my PS Vita, before it was even ported to PC and other consoles. And Persona 4 is a game that really just resonated with me on so many different levels. The story and characters were all amazing, and also with the current mindset and situation I was in, it was all really relatable. Being in high school while playing through this game was definitely something that allowed me to really relate to the characters to a very immersive extent. And the situations and real problems that the cast of Persona 4 faces felt really relatable and genuine. I also at the time didn't really have much friends or people to talk to, so just seeing how well the characters interacted with each other made me really happy. I've played a lot of the Megami Tensei franchise, and I think a lot of them are super underrated, but nothing has never really hit me the same way that Persona 4 has. The bright colors and slick UI, upbeat and charismatic characters, and upbeat J-pop soundtrack really gave me a cozy feeling that I still haven't been able to find in any other form of media. Persona 4 essentially follows a murder mystery in a small town called Inaba, and Inaba is definitely one of my favorite settings from the Persona series. It's a small town on the countryside of Japan, and the game does an amazing job nailing the small town vibe. Going into Inaba at the start, I remember feeling really alone and isolated, as small towns are just not something that people usually do for the setting of their games. But after a while, you'll probably start to open up to the place with just how cozy it feels. You can run into your friends and townspeople around Inaba, and it really helps the place feel alive. And the many kinds of different weather that you can experience will all have different moods and music tied to it. And it's another aspect of where the game shines because the music is genuinely amazing. And for the cloudy days, it's a bit more ominous and atmospheric. The music and weather also helps elevate the story since it is a murder mystery, and with the town being so small there's more of a disturbing feeling with the murders. For the story introductions, you would follow a silent protagonist called Yu Narukami. Originally from the city, but moved to the countryside to live with his uncle since his parents are going to be pretty busy for the next year. His uncle is called Dojima, who's a stern detective who lives with his daughter Nanako, who is his only other source of family living with him in the house. After spending some time getting used to his new area, he would then meet his new friends, Chie, Yukiko, and Yosuke. You spend some time with them and see their personalities bounce off each other, and it's pretty interesting to see how well they get along. But really soon after the introductions, you start noticing that some really weird stuff starts happening around town. And you would soon uncover a really strange occurrence at midnight, where a silhouette would appear in the TV. It would usually start out faint and blurry in the first day, but as the days go by, the image would get clearer and clearer, until eventually you would be able to see a clear image of the person on television. This would usually go on for a couple days, and worked as a heads up to the next victim. Soon after, the person showing up on TV would then get kidnapped and thrown into a parallel world that's called the TV world. This would be the fantasy side of the story, and as crazy as it gets, it's still pretty intuitive to understand. To enter the TV world, the group would go through a department store called Junez, which is basically the equivalent of Walmart. start. Through Junez, they would find a flat screen TV, big enough so that they can all enter the TV world. For the victims being kidnapped and thrown into the other world, their emotions and personal struggles would then manifest into something relating to them. This is what would be used for the many dungeons that you explore throughout the game. The first dungeon, for example, is a castle, because in the victim's mind, she wanted nothing more than a prince to take her away and save her from her problems. Failing to save the victim before the next foggy night would lead to the death of the victim and a game over. The culprit behind it also likes to style his murders in the same pattern, by having their bodies hung upside down on a telephone wire for everyone to see. By finishing the dungeon and saving the victim in a timely manner, then you would be able to progress the story and gather more resources for the case. The plot can definitely get a little goofy and even a little weird as it goes on, but you'll realize that it's also very easy to get invested in what's going on. For me, it's definitely one of the most realistic fantasies I've ever seen for how it went about blending themes like day-to-day struggles and loneliness and other deeply personal issues with the many characters that you'll meet in the game. Everyone has a story to them, and one of my favorite parts of this game is just the slice of life aspects or roaming the town and getting to know the people of Inaba. One of the main appeals of the Persona games is how it's able to mix fun turn-based combat and dungeon crawling with a cool social sim aspect where you can go to school, hang out with friends, and live the life of a normal teenager. With all of this being tied to a very unique time system. With the amount of things that you can do in this game, it's pretty easy to get overwhelmed at some point. One half of the game is filled with your normal JRPG stuff for the story. Hopping through dungeons, leveling up your team, getting new personas to use in battle, fighting bosses, and saving victims in the TV world. Whereas the other half is focused more on the social sim aspect, where you focus more on living your day-to-day life in Inaba. In terms of progression, the days are made up of evening and night, and have a calendar system in place tracking the days and the months. Doing activities like talking to people, or watching movies, or leveling up your stats in any way will take away time from the day and move it forward to the night or the next day. Or if you were to spend the day doing dungeon stuff, then by the time you finish and go home, you would actually be too tired to go out and do other things. While there isn't any specific order to play these games in, for those coming off of Persona 3 to Persona 4, you'll probably be very familiar with a lot of the mechanics and the whole concept of managing your time correctly. It's really engaging, and it's actually still one of the most unique gameplay mechanics that I've ever seen in a video game. As for the dungeon crawling JRPG part of the game, it's also extremely refined, with the battle system having a really engaging system that made me open up to turn-based combat as a whole. Until you run into the exploding dice enemies and they one-shot you and your party for the 40 millionth time. The battle system that Persona 4 uses is called the One More system. The way this works is most to every enemy that you fight has a weakness. And just like any other JRPG, hitting the enemy weakness or hitting a random critical hit will do some good damage and is key to winning the fight as fast as you can, saving resources like your SP. Your SP is your magic gauge that you use for Persona spells and magic, and it's best to reserve it as much as you can if you want to continue fighting. Upon hitting an enemy weakness, you'll get an extra turn which you can use however you'd like. It would also put the enemy into a down position. Getting all the enemies on the field down will allow you to do something called an all-out attack, which will do massive damage to every enemy on screen. Though, depending on the scenario you're in, all-out attacks may not always be a good idea, as some bosses can be pretty resilient towards them. I personally found myself a lot of the time cancelling the all-out attack and just using the turn to buff or output more damage. Along with the enemy weakness, your team also has elemental weaknesses that you need to watch out for. And if the enemy were to hit a weakness off of you or another party member, then the enemy would get another turn. And it would also send you into a down state, leaving you vulnerable for more damage. It's very important to know your team and to know which persona you have equipped, as the persona you have could be a liability during the fight depending on its stats and affinities. Your party members could be specialized in elemental magic or physical skills, it just kinda depends on their stats and what kind of moves they'll end up learning as they level up. Yukiko was definitely one of my favorite teammates to have for their fire and healing skills, and Chie's physical moves are pretty good. Persona 4 isn't necessarily the most difficult game to play, especially coming off of the excruciatingly difficult fights of Persona 3. That game at some points was definitely almost as hard as an SMT game with its bosses and difficulty. And while I wouldn't say that it gets to that level of what the it can definitely get pretty hard at some points. But the game has a lot of ways to remedy the difficulty. Like how your teammates can randomly intrude the fight even if it's not their turn, and they can hit a critical hit on the enemy, dropping them into a down state. And this has a chance of happening a lot more often than you would think too, sometimes even saving the entire fight. There's also random duo events with your team where they would interrupt the fight and do a really cool move that damages and knocks down all the enemies on screen. This one is a bit more dependent on who's in your party, as only a specific setup can do specific moves. Like, for example, Twin Dragons can only be done with people like Chie and Yukiko in your party, Junes Bomber can only be done with Yosuke and Teddy, and Beauty and the Beast can only be done with Kanji and Naoto on your team. These are all pretty cool to look at, and it's kinda nice to see characters who are pretty close in the story have their own little team-up moves. Along with that, there's a navigator of the group being Risei, being one of the better navigators of the series. And I would say that progressing her social link is pretty essential for flooring normal enemies in late game dungeons. As you would level her up, Risei would get new abilities such as seeing every shadow or chest on the floor, or increasing your all-out attacks. I'd say that when she starts getting really good is when she's leveled enough to the point where she can start randomly aiding your team in battle. She would be able to restore some of your magic points so that you can fight longer, and also do things such as buff and charge your entire team, heal, and even revive you after death. These can be really helpful when you're deep into a boss fight, and Risei can just give you exactly what you need to help you out sometimes. A lot of these features are very well appreciated, but ultimately does take away some of the risk when it comes to combat. I usually found myself, especially in late game, not being afraid to go all out on bosses, as I know that I can somewhat rely on Risei to restore a bit of my SP, and that's on top of the items that I already have. Broken as a navigator, but undeniably very useful. Though I don't really think anything can surpass the broken nature of New Game Plus. As for the other aspect of gameplay involved with Persona 4 Golden, that would be called Fusion, and it's undeniably one of my favorite aspects of the entire Megaton series. Fusion is a somewhat complex but very fun feature that just about every Persona and SMT game has. The entire system is kind of a classic with how it's been in every single game, dating all the way back from the very early games of SMT. During Persona 4, you and your team will be able to summon something called a Persona. It's kind of the main gimmick of how you guys fight. A Persona is basically a physical manifestation of your own soul and psyche, and it reflects your inner self. Chie's Persona, for example, wears a yellow tracksuit and is a crazy physical dealer because Chie enjoys a lot of kung fu movies and partakes in kung fu herself. Everyone has a persona that basically represents them and what they believe in, and it's pretty cool to see what they signify and what they evolve to later on. But unlike the rest of the cast, the protagonist is able to use more than one persona at a time. This is what would be called the wildcard ability, allowing him to have many personas at once to his disposal. At the end of a battle, you have the chance of activating something called Shuffle Time, where you'll be able to choose from benefits such as extra money or XP earned from the fight, or skill cards or new personas. Shuffle Time is just one of the more simpler ways to get new personas, but the best way to fully utilize your personas and the skill sets within them are through the Fusion system. Fusion essentially takes two existing personas you have and combines them into a new, stronger persona to use. And to make it even better, you can also transfer skills from the personas used for Fusion into your new persona. You can get some really amazing personas through Fusion, and fusing the right personas can also really make or break bosses. If you're having a hard time fighting a boss who primarily uses electric, then you can just fuse something that just resists or blocks electric completely. Or you can fuse something that can just completely exploit the boss's weakness if he has any. Or you can just go crazy and get some really good physical personas to deal some crazy damage. There's basically a solution for just about every scenario here. You just have to get very creative or look into it a little. There's even a long and semi-confusing fusion calculator that you can find online which can help you fuse something nice. I would personally always have a persona specialized in buffs, debuffs, and healing just in case I needed it. It's always good to be prepared whenever you start a new dungeon or boss fight, so staying up to date on the personas you have in your arsenal is very important. I honestly wouldn't even suggest holding onto a persona for too long, as you'll always be able to fuse them into a stronger persona in a couple levels. The higher level you have, the more options of personas you'll have too. It all comes together pretty well, and I'd say it's pretty satisfying combat. I've been able to get friends of mine who aren't really even fans of turn-based combat to give this a try, and they actually ended up really enjoying it. But of course, this is only one side of the gameplay loop that the Persona series is involved in. The other half is the social aspect of gameplay that I mentioned earlier. This was a feature that started in Persona 3, but it's really refined here in Persona 4. During the times that you're not fighting shadows and progressing dungeons, you'll be spending time in school, hanging out with friends, and doing other tasks during your day-to-day life. And the things that you do here in the real world will directly affect your progression and accomplishments in the dungeons and the TV world. Social links are the name used for the bonds that you will create with the other characters. Every member that you gain on your team will have a social link, and it's heavily encouraged that you take part in them. On surface level, they're essentially relationships or bonds that go a bit farther in developing their character. Every social link that you take a part of revolves around the character's personal struggles, whether it's about them specifically or about someone or something important to them. And they serve as mini stories to get involved in while also developing the character a little more. While some social links are definitely better than the other, they're all pretty nice to go through, as you learn a lot about the characters and what they've been going through on the side. On top of that, you'll also gain XP bonuses towards the personas you make in Fusion, and it can really help you make stronger personas than before. In certain events, hanging out with a party member can also make them learn a new move only available through their social link, which is pretty nice. Though it doesn't just stop with your party members, but you'll also have social links from everyone that you meet in Inaba. Those social links can open up from things like school to part-time jobs, where in all of it you'll meet new people. And of course for the party members, you'll just meet them through the main story. Some of my personal favorites would have to be Yosuke, Ko from the basketball team, Rise, and Dojima and Nanako, as I feel like these really speak volumes in developing their character. There's about 25 total social links in Persona 4, and all of them are very unique in their own right. Yosuke, being one of my favorite characters, is actually one of the first people that you meet in game, and the friendship you share with him is really nice to see. He acts as your best friend who's always there for you no matter what. Early into the game, you learn that his dad is the owner of Junes, which is the supermarket you and your friends go to frequently for hangouts and to enter the TV world. The town of Inaba is so small and quiet that Junes is actually one of the biggest attractions in Inaba, which is again just basically Walmart. The downside of something as big as Junes being in a small town is that the competition of smaller stores and shops are just basically eliminated, as they wouldn't be able to compete with something as convenient as Junes. In the first couple hours of Persona 4, you actually meet a character named Saki Konishi, who is the second victim of the serial murders in Inaba. She was someone who worked at Junes and also went to school with Yosuke and the rest of the cast. And Yosuke makes it pretty clear to you that he likes her and wants to get closer to her. Upon hearing about her death, he was actually the first one in the group to realize that the TV world had something to do with the murders, and he wanted to explore it to find out. But Yosuke would then find out through the TV world that Saki actually hated him, and her family looked down upon her for working at Junes because it was a direct competitor with their own family business. And this is exactly what Yosuke's social link would go into. His feelings for Saki, and how he tried to forget about her after she died, and constantly getting shoved around by his coworkers because his father is the owner of Junes. Also, with being from the city just like you, Yosuke didn't really enjoy Inaba that much. It's a really tough situation that he's in, and his emotions are never really put into the spotlight like this unless you do his social link. He feels like a social outcast because of his affiliation with Junes, and feels like he doesn't really fit in properly. Funnily enough, his persona actually reflects this side of him by having a red cape, because he always wanted to feel important in some way to the people that he knows most. After multiple social events, Narukami helps him realize that all of these negative emotions that he's feeling is understandable given everything that he's went through, and he is really important to the people around him and within the group. Yosuke within the story is very useful, as he is one of the only people actually throwing out theories and trying to connect the dots of the murders, but he's also a great comic relief character who is used very well for the lighter moments of the game. And I mean, he also admittedly has some of the funniest scenes in the game.
That'll be pretty cute.
Is he cute? What do you think, Kanji?
Huh? What are you asking me for?
Well, I was just wondering if he was your type.
Oh, I get it. What you're really asking is, will you please beat the shit out of me, Kanji?
Dude, the girls cook just for us! If I've gotta, prove my manhood and stuff here, so be it!
As for the other characters outside of the main group, they're also pretty great. Nanako and Dojima, for example, is one of my favorites in the game. Once again, Dojima is your uncle that you've been staying with in Inaba, and Nanako is your 6-year-old cousin. While these characters do have a role in the story, they're more so important to the main character Narukami, since they're of course his family. Their social links are also kind of tied together, as they're both two sides of a similar story. Ryotaro Dojima is a busy detective who takes his work very seriously. Ever since the murders have started taking place, the police force has been very busy trying to keep up and stopping them from continuing. It's also important to remember that because of how small Inaba is, the public has been very on edge, as the town has never really experienced anything like this before. The town has always been more used to a quiet and peaceful setting given its size. And so because of the murders and social anxiety, Dojima has also been very on edge and unfortunately has been spending less and less time with his daughter Nanako. You notice that a lot of the time he would actually be so busy with his job that he would come home really late some nights, and other nights he wouldn't be able to come home at all. A little into to Dojima's social link, and you would learn that his wife Chisato had actually died from a car crash many years ago, and the man who ran her over has still never been found. This is something that's been really bothering Dojima for years now, and even though it's a closed case at this point, he's been working on it alone on his free time. This obsessive nature for the case has led to him overworking himself a lot of the time and not really spending any time with his daughter Nanako, or even having any time for himself. He became so fixated on the case that even looking at Nanako would just remind him of his wife Chisato, which would just fill him with more sorrow and regret. And from Nanako's social link and just events in the story, you would learn that she's very mature for her age. Living day to day with a very busy father and no mother, Nanako would learn how to do things such as walk to school by herself, do her own homework, and even cook for herself. It's pretty easy to tell that she's very self-dependent because of how busy her father is. You can't really help but feel bad, as all of this just became very routine for Nanako. And to make it even worse, there's a lot of moments in the game where she would express her desire to see her mother again. And she also doesn't really understand that her father Dojima is very busy with the murder cases and is forced to work very long hours as a detective. To Nanako, she sees it as neglect and thinks that her father doesn't want to spend time with her and he doesn't love her. Doing her social link and being there for Nanako is exactly what she needs the most, as she wanted nothing more than to just have a family who loves and supports her. Dojima was so afraid of another tragedy that in his social link he was actually scared to take you in for the year, as he was afraid of losing someone close to him again. He didn't want to get close to you emotionally and have another family dynamic, only for you to have some tragic misfortune soon after. By the end of Dojima's social link, he actually promises himself that he would stop running away from his problems and start opening up to find more time to spend with his daughter. To solidify his promise, he ends up giving you a mug that his wife used to symbolize that you are now family, and it's honestly a really nice scene. The entire dynamic was extremely memorable for me, and I think it's actually one of the most realistic and saddening depictions of a broken family. Given the situation that Nanako and Dojima were in, it was really hard for both of them, and it honestly wasn't really easy for Dojima to confront Narukami on what he was going through as well. I think that they're two of the best social links in the entire series, and I really don't think that it's something that people should miss out on when playing Persona 4 Golden. I won't go over all of the social links as there's just way too many to cover, but even the minor social links that you have access to are really deep and meaningful. Ko Ichijo is from the basketball team, and you start off as friends who just enjoy playing basketball in the afternoon club that you're in. But a little into the social link, and you would soon learn about his family struggles at home and how he was even adopted. He would tell you about his love for basketball and how it's actually one of his favorite hobbies, but it's also looked down upon by his adopted parents. Ko Ichijo's social link is basically just an inside look at a character who wants to feel special within his family, and he has a fear of being neglected or pushed aside by his newborn sister, who is actually related by blood, unlike he is. Of course, not every social link is created equally, as there are some social links that are created with much more depth and interesting ideas than the others. And of course, it's the same deal with the other games, kinda like how everyone universally agrees that Akinari from Persona 3 and EY from Persona 5 are amazing for their interesting stories. And then on the lower side, we have Oya from Persona 5. But even through the lows, there are some redeeming factors with every social link, and all of them do somewhat of a good job exploring the different struggles of everyday life. There's just so many different themes here that I know some of them hit home for a lot of players. But other than the gameplay and social links, there was something else that made me fall in love with Persona 4. And while the soundtrack is iconic, what hit me the most was definitely the themes and the story.
So real, the way you make me feel in your eyes, the way to hide your sweet desire. Yeah.
So the story of Persona 4 is undoubtedly a very long one, but it's also a story that made me feel emotions that I never felt while playing a video game before. The reception for Persona 4 is somewhat of a mixed bag when it comes to certain things about its story, but in the grand scheme of things, I think it's something that everyone can appreciate. From the story, to how realistic the main cast of characters are, to how the twists and turns were executed, and to the style and music of the game. It's all done really well, and it's very easy to find yourself getting engaged and honestly pretty attached to the characters. Though, as with everything that I've mentioned before, I've been able to avoid talking about major plot points of the game. So if you haven't played Persona 4 Golden, then I'd highly suggest you play the game before finishing the video, as the mystery of everything and the mystery of the killer is one of the main appeals of the game. As I've mentioned before with the story intro, victims of the case were shown on the Midnight Channel, which was sort of a supernatural occurrence that would only happen on rainy nights. From there, the person on TV would end up getting kidnapped and thrown into a parallel world called the TV world. Failure to save them would end up with their deaths, and they would probably end up getting hung like the other victims, upside down on a telephone wire for the entire town to see. You would start out with your friends that you met in the beginning, Yosuke, Chie, and Yukiko, trying to save people in the TV world and also trying to piece together the information you gathered so you can find the killer. The loop that would go on for a majority of the game is saving people who enter the TV world, having them join your team, and then they ultimately become a part of the main characters of the story. And with every character, we get closer to revealing the truth and connecting the dots. Behind the scenes, the killer would also watch the news, and whenever someone is interviewed on television, then that would usually be their next target. They would usually appear on the Midnight Channel as sort of a heads up, and then they would soon after get kidnapped. And the cycle would only be broken when you meet a character called Naoto Shirogane. Naoto would be the final member of the investigation team, and would be a major help in investigating the case. She is a detective who was previously part of the police force, but was ultimately dropped due to her age and her extreme lengths of solving the case. While she was in the police force, Naoto wanted to solve the case all by herself without any assistance, but ultimately did make good advancements without the police force. From things like the killer's methods to the pattern of the kidnapped victims and how Narukami and his team was involved with the case due to how a majority of his team is made up of victims who were once kidnapped. Naoto was able to decipher a big amount of what was going on all by herself. And once joining the team, Naoto easily becomes one of the most valuable characters who was able to brainstorm a lot of the solutions for the case. The story could take a while to get going, but once it picks up, it really knows how to hook you. Everything is somewhat smooth for the characters until the date November 5th. Later that day, Dojima would come home from work and would hand Narukami a weird letter that was in the mail. And this would actually be the second letter directed towards Narukami that he's gotten throughout the game. The first letter that Narukami got in the game had nothing more than a sentence saying, "Don't rescue anymore." Now with the new letter directed towards Narukami, it's a bit more threatening, with the letter saying, "If you don't stop this time, someone close will be put in and killed." With Dojima standing right behind you, he grabs the letter from your hands as he's very concerned on why you would be getting a letter like this. Even though Dojima holds you in high regard in his life now, he was always a little suspicious of you as he is still a detective. He noticed that the serial murders around Inaba only started happening just a couple days after you came down to Inaba, and that all the people that you've been hanging out with were victims of the kidnappings. With the threatening letter directly addressed to you, he would end up taking you down to the police station for interrogation, and he ends up questioning you right next to his partner Adachi. And even though you get an option to dodge the question or to tell him the truth, it doesn't really matter as Narukami ends up telling him the truth anyway. But as you start telling Dojima about the discoveries you guys made, like the TV world and personas, he doesn't believe anything that you say. Which makes perfect sense, as I mean, no sane human being would ever believe a story about a TV world with personas and shadows. Dojima, getting fed up with everything that you're saying to him, would end up taking your phone and leaving, with it just being you and Adachi in the room. But with all this going on, something really unexpected starts happening. For the entire duration of you being in the office, Nanako has been home alone, and shortly after Dojima leaves, your friends bust into the police station to inform you that she's just been kidnapped. This is where the story takes a dramatic and honestly pretty emotional turn, as there's a lot going on from here on. Dojima ends up trying to chase down the kidnapper, who was supposedly the culprit behind the murders, his name being Taro Namatame. With Namatame also a part of the crash, he would end up going into the TV to hide, taking Nanako with him. Shortly after the incident, you would end up sending Dojima to the hospital, and you would continue pursuing Namatame in order to save Nanako. Though of course, just like with anyone else, upon entering the TV world, Nanako's personal struggles and mental state would manifest into a dungeon. And it's easily one of my favorite dungeons in the game. This dungeon would be called Heaven, and it's literally called Heaven because in Nanako's mind, she wants nothing more than to see her mother again, who she believes is in heaven. The characters even mention it in the dialogue of just how this looks like a storybook vision of heaven given her age. It's definitely one that kinda got to me when I was playing the game for the first time, as I feel like it does everything that it possibly can to make Nanako look like the sweetest child ever. From how she greets you every time you come back home, to how she even interacts with you and your friends. And the music of the dungeon just brings an extra layer of sadness, given how it's about Nanako's loneliness and how she misses her mother.
Can't get my mind out of those memories. Now time to tell them, don't take my joy.
Another perfect example of why Shoji Meguro is just one of my favorite composers. After taking down Namatame and rescuing Nanako, you would start questioning Namatame, but things just aren't adding up. While Namatame would admit to the kidnappings of the victims, the two people that actually died in the beginning of the story, he has a rock-solid alibi for. Those two being Saki Konishi and Mayumi Yamano, who he has no involvement with their deaths. It's pretty easy to think that Namatame is just insane, especially with how he refers as kidnapping as saving people, but he is just genuinely really afraid and unstable as you talk to him. After talking a little more with Namatame, you start to realize that you won't get any crucial information out of him, and that there's actually much more that you're missing right now. After putting together all of the clues that you found throughout the entire game, you slowly start to come to a conclusion on the man behind the murders. A person who could have been behind the first two murders, and also wouldn't be too suspicious given his occupation. And the one person who could fit this criteria would have to be Dojima's partner, Toru Adachi. Now, there's a lot to say about this funny little guy.
I don't have anything to say to you. If crimes could be solved by appealing to morality, you wouldn't need the police. The person you believed in was a version of me who only existed in your head. You decided on your own to believe in me, and that decision betrayed you. Why complain about it to me?
Adachi is a part of the police force and is again partners with your uncle Dojima. He's very present during the story and is sort of seen as a goofball detective who's pretty unprofessional. He's usually slacking off somewhere, and whenever he's around your team, he'll sometimes talk a lot, usually talking about things going on in the police investigation before stopping himself saying that he said too much. Adachi, in my opinion, is the perfect villain for a story like this given his character. And the game does a good job at hiding the twists as well, as I mean, who would ever expect a goofball detective who can barely do his job right to be the murderer? I actually really enjoyed how everything panned out up to his reveal, and I really liked when he started speaking about his motives. Adachi's reasoning for doing what he did was really interesting, and if you ended up doing his social link, then I think you would realize how he reached his breaking point. Adachi was just an average guy who did well in school, and was at the top of the police academy when he entered. And his entire life, he's been working to have a good future and a fulfilling career. So when all was said and done and he graduates with flying colors, he was assigned to the lackluster countryside of Inaba, and this caused him to be extremely unhappy. And through his social link, you learn that Adachi is kind of miserable. He lives by himself in the countryside and isn't making enough money to fully support himself, and since he can't cook, he admits to buying a bunch of cabbages to eat, as that's what he survives off of. And he also just really dislikes Inaba. One reason being, for as hard as he's worked, he believes that he deserves more than to be trapped doing detective work for a place that he sees as boring. But also because, in his mind, he believes that he's above everyone living in the town. Upon chasing down Adachi, he would end up jumping and hiding into the other world for safety, and of course, like everyone else, it would create a dungeon using his current mental state. And the dungeon that would come out of Adachi would be honestly terrifying. Mangetsu Inaba would be the name of his dungeon, which is basically a distorted and corrupted version of Inaba. Every floor that you advance in his dungeon, Adachi would be berating you with his philosophy and somewhat harassing you to some extent. And Narukami, multiple times during Adachi's social link, would try to break his social barrier, but at that point he's just too far gone. As close as you guys get during his social link, it never really advances to anything that will get Adachi to really trust and open up to you. I think that this was Atlas's way of showing what can happen to someone who denies the world and denies friendships, unlike Narukami. Adachi is essentially the exact opposite of you with how he went about his time in Inaba. Just like Narukami, he was kind of thrown into this new area that he didn't know much about or even know anyone there. But unlike Narukami, instead of trying to start meaningful friendships or relationships with anyone, he became bitter and just rejected the world entirely. Even his persona, Mangetsu Izanagi, is a corrupted and warped version of your persona, Izanagi. It's really interesting to see how well they did the symbolism in Adachi's character, but it's even more interesting on how the community turned him into one of the funniest memes ever. The themes and situations of Persona 4 Golden were some that really hit deep for me. It was the first time I played a game so ambitious with connecting its gameplay and themes into the story. The entire concept of a persona fusing, and social links, and how it's all loosely connected to the gameplay, and the entire grind of everything was just really cool for me. It also introduced some of the most realistic cast of characters that I've ever seen, whether it was from the main cast or the other many people that you can meet around Inaba. And I mean, Dojima's entire character arc was about him learning to accept his wife's death and open up more to his daughter and the people around him. If that doesn't speak for the emotional highs that the game touches on, then I don't know what does. I really do think that playing this game has allowed me to open up to more types of media that I wouldn't have tried before. And even through all the games and franchises that I've played and finished at this point, I always find a way to come back to Persona 4 Golden. From the internal struggles that the cast experiences to how they eventually move past them and grow as people. It's executed extremely well, and it also matches up with the game's entire theming of finding the truth and pursuing your true self. And on the final day of the game, being March 20th, after you say goodbye to all your friends, Narukami would have to leave Inaba. Since he was only going to be here for an entire year, after the year is done, then he would be heading back home. With all the memories and friendships that Narukami would have made that year, it's all leaving with him, making the end of the game very bittersweet. And with you having accomplished everything and ending the case, you would think that everything is over. But upon denying the option to instantly go home and deciding to explore a little more, the game would actually reward you by unlocking an entirely new dungeon and event. And it's something that you could have missed entirely, especially as the game even encourages you to talk to everyone and go straight home. It doesn't even slightly hint that there's anything left for you to discover. Only the player would get rewarded for pursuing every last detail and discovering the truth about who gave you, Adachi, and Namatame the power of Persona initially. With the dungeon being called Yomotsu Hirasaka, it's a really cool final dungeon that wraps up the story entirely. Unless you would decide to play the spin-off sequels, of course. And to end it all off, it has a really heartwarming epilogue where Narukami would come back to the town 1 year later, and he would see how his friends have changed over the past couple months. And they're all still the same characters that you've grown to love over the game, but have grown and changed just a little bit. Chie would end up growing her hair out, Teddy and Yosuke look more or less the same, Yukiko looks a bit more mature, Rise has an entirely new hairstyle, and Kanji is... And the game ends off in such a nice way that, upon playing for the first time, I got a little teary-eyed while watching.
Your cooking is barely food, Chie.
Shut up! What about mine?
It's cold, Yosuke.
I could have made something too.
Please don't.
What was that? I can cook if I put my mind to it. So can I. That's...
Gotcha. Got it?
Oh, yeah.
Well then. 1 and...
It's good to see you, Senpai.
Kanji, it was welcome back. How could you mess that up?
Hey, just shut up, all right? I just got stage fright, that's
Well,
all.
I figured someone would blow it.
We are living our lives. Above it, so much information. Come on, let go the remote. Don't you know you're ready on a jump for that? Turn us the boat, the book in on the go, but I don't use. Hey, I've been causing. Loading. Quickly reaching maximum capacity. Want it. Gonna show some my identity. Get up on your feet, down the world. Get your gleam.